today I'd like to talk about pain and pleasure of using Max in life as an environment for an audiovisual composition. And some of the things I will talk about deal more with a kind of general audiovisual paradigm, while some of them are kind of very specific to my personal compositional needs. And I guess in order to make more sense of this talk, I need to show you first a bit of my work. So I will start with two excerpts of the piece I was playing here on Wednesday. So in the first excerpt, you will see that the piece is driven mainly by the visuals. I'm playing with geometry, and geometry is triggering sounds, and that's how the rhythms are created. In the second part, the piece is more music driven, but then also the music was composed from the material from that kind of more visual driven side, and also there was adjustment, of course, on the musical side. Okay, now I'll skip a little bit forward. Okay, and so on. Yeah, for me it's really important that kind of these audiovisual objects can form really strong bonds, and one of the things I kind of like to play with when composing is to kind of modulate this gap between audio and visuals. So let's say that the small gap would be kind of very convincible one-on-one object, while when the gap gets bigger, we have kind of more poetic distance and kind of more space for interpretation. And I try to use this in a way as kind of rhythm and harmony can be used to create tension and release and stuff like that. Although I think in audiovisual world it's kind of always more subjective, because things can be kind of just to some extent justified by some underlying mathematics. I like to call my way of composing a non-hierarchical audiovisual composition, because I'm trying to kind of give equal importance to sound and image. Sometimes it's more kind of democratic pluralism, which just means that sometimes the image is leading, sometimes the sound is more leading. But there are also kind of places in between when, for instance, I spend like a lot of time just switching between the two paradigms when creating audiovisual phrases. So, for instance, one example would be instance, this phrase would be completely different if I would just create an audio and then apply visuals to it, or the other way around. So the point for me is that I need to have a real-time audiovisual system when I can tweak things as I go along and kind of constantly jump between the two. Also, in kind of similar way, I jump between two kind of different approaches to composing, and that is creating tools to realize compositional ideas and playing with tools to discover ideas. I like to say for myself that I have really bad ideas and I need to kind of just experiment, and that's also one of the powers for me of using computer for doing any kind of art release, that you can go really beyond your imagination, because when the system gets kind of complex, you can't really imagine what will happen when you will turn one knob, or maybe just change the sequence of effects in a chain or something like that. So there's a lot of serendipity and just like experiments in my work, but then of course also when such moments happen, I then try to kind of develop a clear plan and what I want to do and when I want to, where I want to take this further. So it's kind of constant feedback loop between these two approaches. Okay, so I think mainly what I want to show you today really is kind of my audiovisual system, the more technical part of my work. So the system exists between Max Jitter and Ableton Live. I have all the visuals are done in Jitter, and of course no visuals in Live. Then in Jitter, I mean, Live takes care of all kind of sound synthesis, sampling processes, most of it. The reason for that is that I found Jitter or Max really bad when it comes to triggering huge samples, huge banks of samples. So for instance, if I load, if I use, I don't know, like hundreds of poly instances to have lots of sounds inside, and to trigger them really quickly, there's a lot of polyphony. Basically just like, it could be just like transients one over the another. The CPU just like goes extremely high. So that was one of the reasons why I moved as much as possible to Live. But then on the other hand, there is some geometry driven sound synthesis going on in Jitter, which I can also show you some examples. This drone, basically all the movement that you hear in music comes from the analysis of this visual movement. There's like kind of a lot of layers, but everything, all the modulations come from this visual movement. Then another example would be this. But this, unfortunately, I didn't use this in my work. So the reason, I mean, visually you can see similar things in my work, so definitely that kind of algorithm was used for moving visuals. But since my audiovisual system at that time was like going into red values, the CPU was like there was like a lot of frame dropping or a lot of glitching in audio, so I couldn't afford to run this granular particles based granulator, which is made in Max. And I think I would need to, because it's again very CPU extensive, because when you have, as I said before, many instances of poly, CPU can grow very, very quickly. So instead of that, I just kind of use the kind of sound designing tricks for some short part in my piece to kind of recreate the sounds that this guy would do. But yeah, I hope I'll open. I'll manage to use this in a kind of more interesting, creative way in some of the future pieces. Then the next thing in life, I have accurate time. It's like independent time where I'm storing all my envelopes, all automations, and in Max the time is kind of non-accurate because I'm using QMetro, and it's basically a banks-based time, so I cannot use any objects that use time in milliseconds or samples, because I'm using at the end I'm rendering everything offline, so everything needs to be bank based, and so for instance a lot of really cool objects that exist in Max like g.anim and so on are just like out of question. You cannot use them. There are other problems of bank-based time as well, because when I run the system in real time, I get the frame rate drops sometimes like to 30 frames per second. This piece was made in 60 frames per second, and that means that if you're running some physics algorithms that kind of are based on the previous iterations always, so it's like a kind of loop. So that the result of what's happening with the physics depends on basically how many iterations happened, and when you have like in 1 second 30 more iterations, then the result is very different. Yeah, then sometimes I need to kind of plot the frame rate across the timeline and adjust the speed for the offline render. So for instance, the step of how the particles move, let's say, or the speed of particle movement would, for instance, be half as before if the frame rate would drop 2 times. I hope that made sense.
So you emulate what you've seen in real time, so that what you're seeing in real time is what you get from the offline render.
Yes, because the thing is, for instance, like if I make, I don't know, in my offline render some physics-based effects that grows into, I don't know, a cube, maybe when I was doing it offline it would just like totally go out of control because there will be more frames. So usually I just kind of then take the average of the frame rate and adjust kind of these speed correlations for different sections. But then if needed, you can also just like plot an automation, record it into Max, and just record it. But yeah, I'll talk more about that when I come to offline rendering, which is another kind of interesting thing, because here I need to offline render 2 independent softwares. Okay, live, as I said, all automations, envelopes, and then jitter, no automations, no envelopes, and there are some MIDI triggers going on both sides, and otherwise the automations are passed through UDP messages to the jitter side. I want to start with the visual side of my audiovisual system, and here you can see I'm having 3 kind of sub-patchers, which I called modules. I like to think of this visual system as a kind of modular system, and one object is I call it 3D object, which is which basically gives the right format for the further processing of the matrix that gets output from the GGL model. And for instance, then here I have the source of modulation, which some of you would recognize. It's BFG, procedural noise, and then this is where the modulation happens. I call it a distortion module. So for instance, if I set the amount of modulation to 0, you see the original 3D object. Now, in getting the 3D model into jitter is kind of straightforward process, but in order to get a good performance and accurate control over the vertices, it's a very complicated job. Because the problem is that the matrix that comes from the model object consists in average 6 times more vertices is needed, and that's like a huge problem because we are struggling for every frame rate, and 6 times more vertices is huge. And the reason for that is that in OpenGL you can draw triangle meshes in 2 different ways, and the format that comes from the model object is adjusted for the triangles. And for instance, if we have a look at, I don't know, let's say this vertex here, you can see that around this vertex we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8 triangles. And one way of drawing triangles in OpenGL is that you specify 3 points for each triangle, and then just like connect everything. So in that case, you would have 8 vertices at exactly the same point that come from these surrounding 8 triangles. So in order to solve that, I needed to make an external that just removes all the duplicates from this from this matrix. And of course, in jitter, as many other things are nowhere documented, so you just kind of need to spend a lot of time living with pain before you realize what's really needed. Yeah, there's one forum user made this kind of patch for removing these duplications in Max, and also it re-indexes the okay, first I need to explain the other way of drawing triangles. So the other way of drawing triangles is that you have only as much vertices as needed, but then you need an index matrix that tells all these connections how to draw the lines. So when you do the geometry reduction, you need to create this index matrix that will tell all the lines how to draw. And for the model that you have seen before, which is this one, it would take literally weeks to just do the vertices reduction and reindexing inside Max, because Max is so slow for such tasks, because you just need to compare so many vertices between themselves. So with my Java external, this job can be done in around 5 minutes. for this. And also, I mean, I'm not a great coder, so I guess that can be done much faster if but you know, for such tasks, I'm not really bothered with the time it takes, unless it's weeks, because this then really stops your creative process.
How much video would take weeks? So how many frames? Is it just one frame?
Oh no, it's not a frame.
It's a
It's
3D
basically it's just a 3D model. It's just the geometry matrix where this data is stored. All right. So that's not even a frame. It's just yeah. It just.
But does it not redraw for every frame?
No,
Or
then.
is it only redrawing the,
No, I mean-
the new information?
I mean, once the matrix is reduced, then we forget about and we just use the new version,
Okay.
and then you do the maths or whatever on that thing. Okay. Okay, so where to go next? Okay, maybe then I can show you also a little bit of kind of this modular approach and serendipity things that I was talking before. So for instance, here is one module. I mean, I have many of these modules, but I just prepared one for here. Okay, this is not needed. It's kind of noise source, and this was kind of specially designed to be placed in between here. So basically, I'll be just adding noise to that BFG source. Now if I add some noise amount, we get these shaky things, and then I have a resolution of the noise. You can get this kind of fine grain noise, or kind of more jumpy. And all my modules are having the option for kind of off mode bypass, because that then enables me to create kind of really complex chains and without using too much CPU. And yeah, everything is CPU based, because I'm just not I don't have the necessary knowledge to do this on a GPU. But also I'm not sure if everything is possible to be done there, but I guess it is. So here, instead of on-off button, I have it said that when amount is set to 0, this goes automatically to bypass mode. So I can use only one automation enabled on to kind of turn it off, rather than having two automations, one for amount and one for on-off. And then, as I was talking before about lucky experiments, we can just try to do something with this object which it was not intended for. I'll do this here, and I'll just put it here.
Shouldn't it go to the second inlet on BFG stored?
Sorry?
The output of BFG source going to the second inlet of BFG stored.
No, that's correct. That definitely made something wrong, because that should look way different as it looks now. Anyway, so that's a demonstration of not a very lucky experiment. Yeah, I don't know. It should look much funkier, but it doesn't. So that's also part of the fun. Okay. Let's move on. Okay, so I can show you then also the. Okay, what time is? How much time I have left? Like 15 minutes. Okay. Okay, then I think I'll just skip some of the parts here, and we'll go further to the. Some other example. But yeah, essentially what I'm doing is I'm just like processing geometry all the way, like audio signals. I deal here with geometry. That's kind of the main thing. So besides having these points and triangles and lines to draw the meshes, I wanted something more dynamic, some algorithm that would adjust to the shape and the movement of the geometry, and that's why I implemented an algorithm which is kind of very popular lately, but if you apply it to different sources as is a general practice, you can get very cool results. And I guess that's some also lesson that we've learned in the audio world. Okay, so here I have an ant object module. So the algorithm, how this is drawn, is that basically what you've seen at the beginning of my piece, and that is when two dots are close enough together, they form a connection. So if I change the criteria when the lines, I mean how far the lines should be in order to connect, you get like very different effects. And yeah, so then when you distort the image, you can get all the time some dynamic connections going on, which I think keeps the eye busy and makes things more interesting. And then just for the sake of fun, I can increase the amount of noise, and yay. So that's that. Okay, now let's go a little bit to the audio side. And yeah, for instance, maybe also interesting, like when I run this algorithm for connecting points, I constantly get this error message here, but that's nothing you can do with this error message because it doesn't really tell you anything about the code, and it's something that I think the guys at Cycling 74 should sort out. But it seems that, I don't know, at least my feeling is that there's not really an interest to improve the kind of environment for programming in Java inside Max, because also the editor is really outdated. So it's kind of hard to work with Java inside Max. Okay, so then, for instance, when I applied that algorithm, you saw an ant. I don't know what's going on really. on this thing that was the result, and then I wanted to kind of hear the how it would sound to kind of sonify these connections. I don't know what's really the problem, but I'm having here on this screen I'm seeing the full picture, but when I put it here it just jumps in the corner. Oh, now we have it. So here we have just like focusing on few points, and they're sending MIDI triggers to Ableton, where you can hear the sound. And then in Ableton I have on a special MIDI track Max for Live device, which is just taking care of automations. So for instance, if I do some automation here, like this. So this will send the automation to UDP channel 8501, which I've already patched. Here, and now it controls the speed parameter, and now you can see that the object is reacting according to the automation here. And that's essentially how things.
Can we see that over a longer? Can you just pull the curve out? It's the bottom of the no, not visually. Actually, in time. Could we just see it happening over a longer time period?
Sure. Okay, cool. And then like the thing that you've seen before, like in my piece, it might seem like it was edited a lot. It's like it seems like there's a lot of different footage and then just cut together and edited, but it's not the case really. It's just I'm automating a lot of parameters and camera angles and zooming and all that. So I actually export one long 8-minute take from Max, and it looks like it's been cut and all that. And I think, I mean, at least for me, the advantage of that is that sometimes when you edit at the end, you just miss. Oh, I would really wish that I would have this recording and that recording. But that way, I can kind of create material as I edit, although I don't edit. But then, of course, at the end, sometimes I would edit something if there's a need for it. It's not that I would have some kind of constraining rule on this. Okay, I think at the end, I would just like to touch on offline render. I mean, the reason for the pain in the title, I only managed to scratch the surface of it because it's really a pain to work, like especially with meshes in Max. I think in Jitter, if you work with this like objects and G.multiple, GL multiple, there's things seems to work much better. But when it comes to meshes, because these are essentially just like points and not objects, these little dots, then the lights don't work correctly. And this like the biggest problem is when you try to render things offline and you need to first capture everything to a texture, and everything just looks different, like super different. Like, okay, I can show you. Like so, okay, that's the what I want it to be. And now let's capture this to texture, and that is the result. It's like, and then after a lot of investigation, I mean, at least at the beginning, even the developers of Jitter were not able to help me. So I mean never mind. But yeah, then I found some solution together with Rob. Slowly we came to the solution, which is this. But then when you, I mean, it's just like a lot of things you need to kind of set. But then you also need to really readjust the colors and the sizes in order to get similar to what it was before. Although it's nothing, you cannot achieve exactly the same result. Never. It's like no way. And that's when you're like composing and you really want to record things and move forward. Then you're just like stuck constantly with technical problems, and that was just a nightmare, really. Yeah. Okay, offline render. So how to render offline something that happens across two different softwares. So essentially what I do first is I move all my automations into jitter matrices. I do that by, I mean, I had to do a separate device, patch to record this automation. And then I use my MIDI keyboard, I press play, which starts recording and runs my Ableton project at the same time. I clean Ableton projects out of every scenes or whatever I have, samplers, all audio is kind of taken out. I just like leave these automation tracks. And usually for the sections I have around, I don't know, 60, 70 automations. Then I just like sample everything at a frame rate of my video. Although also the automations are set to be refreshed on the frame rate of the video. And also what's really cool about these automations is that they output values only when they change. So they are not constantly outputting anything. So you can just like connect them directly to objects in Max. You don't need to kind of store values in float objects and then bank them with the frame rates. So that's really cool. But then yeah, just to be kind of really in sync, I sample everything at the frame rate, record everything into matrices, then I import this matrix into the Max project and render it offline. And in case there is some MIDI note generation going on the Max side, I write all the MIDI notes into call object. And for instance, for the first 9 minutes of the piece, there was around 4,200 notes, which just like the call object showed me. And then there is, I mean, I was quite lucky because in a very kind of late version of Ableton, the option appeared to generate MIDI clips from data. So I can then transform these call objects with MIDI information into audio clip, into MIDI clips, and then I can render Ableton offline, bring everything together, and if there's no MIDI triggering going on from the jitter side, usually things are in sync, while otherwise not necessary, and then a new nightmare begins. But yeah, it's kind of complicated, convoluted process.